Dr. Lee Morris is a highly respected specialist in equine reproduction and is an honorary lecturer at the University of Waikato. After training at the University of Sydney, Lee completed a doctorate in animal reproduction and obstetrics in Canada. She's now based in Waikato, working with horse breeders around the country.
Equibreed is all about producing champions for the New Zealand horse breeder for any type of horse, whether it's a sport horse or thoroughbred or Arab. We apply reproductive techniques, so artificial insemination, fertility treatments, embryo transfer, semen technologies, semen collection, stallion fertility and stallion training. Anything to do with making a foal, we will pursue that line of business. When I first came to New Zealand, frozen semen was a very new technology that was available to New Zealanders.
Right, got a nice pregnancy here.
The introduction of this technology was slow to New Zealand because of the import requirements for the semen. But since 2002, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of mares that have been bred to frozen semen across the board in the standard bred and the sport horse industries. Our customers are mainly sport horse breeders and standard bred breeders, mainly mare owners. And we also import semen from a variety of stallion owners in Europe and a couple from America and Australia as well. When I first arrived in New Zealand in 2002, there were a low number of high-profile sport horse stallions that had been imported from overseas and have provided a very good base of foundation mares for New Zealand's sport horse industry. But since the introduction of frozen semen, we now use over 150 stallions a year, and the world is the oyster for our mare owners, which is really exciting. The thoroughbred industry, they just allow natural service to produce a foal. So the thoroughbreds would not register a foal made by artificial insemination. If you had a thoroughbred that was a polo pony or an eventer, that doesn't matter as long as it's not registered in the stud book. But for registration in the thoroughbred stud book, it needs to be natural service. And that's more a traditional aspect of that industry, and it's a very old established industry, and they're the main reasons that those rules are in place. When I first came to New Zealand, the per-cycle pregnancy rates with frozen semen were reportedly very low. There was a report of about 19% per-cycle pregnancy rates. But now the per-cycle pregnancy rates are normally between 45 and 60% per cycle, and for some stallions much higher. But the per-cycle pregnancy rate with natural mating in the thoroughbred industry has only been reported as 53% per cycle. So really the frozen semen and AI does very well with similar pregnancy rates to natural mating now. So that gives the mare owner a lot of choice for their breeding programs. We're about to do an embryo transfer in this horse. So she was inseminated about 9 days ago and ovulated 8 days ago, and the embryo comes into the uterus. So all the fertilisation occurred in the posh horse, the competition horse or the race horse, standard bred. And then we flush that embryo out of her uterus and take it into the lab, clean it up, give it a bath, and then transfer it into a surrogate mare that's at a similar stage of her cycle. And the reason we do that is either because the donor mare needs to go back into competition, or she might have a fertility problem, or she might be an old horse, or you might want several pregnancies a year out of that horse. So it's a good way of reducing your genetic interval and increasing your genetic gain. One of the biggest challenges in New Zealand is the fact that the competition season and breeding season are right on top of each other. So with the competition mares, we try to do their embryo transfers either right at the beginning of the season or right at the end of the season. But now that we can freeze embryos as well, as long as the mare's cycling, and we can get embryos out of her whenever she's cycling and freeze them and transfer them later at a time of year that suits the mare breeder or the mare owner. so they can provide their own surrogates as well, which will save them quite a lot of money, and they can just store them and potentially even sell them to people later on. It has all the same limitations as any breeding program, so the mare fertility and the stallion fertility will impact on the success rate of recovering an embryo. But once we get an embryo, we have over 80% survival after transfer. Certain times of the year, we'll have over 90% survival after transfer, so early in the season is usually a bit better than later in the season. But it's a good technique. We're developing a new technology for the New Zealand market called oocyte recovery, and that will mean that we can recover oocytes directly, or eggs directly from the ovaries that are not fertilised yet. Then we take those eggs into the lab and fertilise them in the lab using an in vitro fertilisation technique. Once we've got the eggs in the laboratory, we mature them in the incubator overnight, and then we're able to just select one sperm cell and inject that actually into the egg using a micromanipulator. And that technique's called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, which has enormous benefits for saving semen and recovering genetics after a stallion or mare has died as well. The genetics in New Zealand are now world class, so we're definitely able to produce horses that are genetically as good as those in Europe. So now we need the riders to ride them as well as the riders in Europe. But certain industries in New Zealand, like the polo industry and the standardbred industry, they export their genetics very successfully around the world, as does the thoroughbred industry.
This program was made with funding from New Zealand On Air.